Here from Accenture, or as you say in Finland, Accenture. I already asked him, and he told me that his favorite band when he was 15 was Nirvana. Who else was Nirvana? Anyone else? There you go. You got a couple of other folks around there. Cool. So please, welcome to the stage, talking about whether smart cities will ever live up to their hype, from Accenture, Mr. Simon Giles. Simon.
Thank you. I'm guessing you probably would have just guessed that by looking at my haircut that Nirvana was my favorite band when I was 15. So thank you so much for having me here in Tampere today. I've been here a couple of days, and it's been a fantastic couple of days to hear about the story of where Tampere is going to be going on its digital journey over the next few years. And I heard the introduction by the ex-mayor first thing this morning, and she talked about a sense of optimism in the city around the direction that the city is going in. And from what I've heard over the last couple of days, I completely understand that. However, strategy is very different to execution. And what we have here at the moment is a fantastic strategy and the promise of execution. And what I want to talk about over the next 35 or 40 minutes is how do we move from the hype that is set up in an excellent vision and strategy to a point where we can execute effectively. And I would say that there are very few examples, if any, of cities that are really executing their smart city strategies at scale at the moment. There are pilots all over the place, but very, very few examples of where pilots are moving out of pilot mode to scale at full city scale. And if this city wants to achieve its ambitions, it has to find the answer to that. So I spoke in Helsinki about a year ago about the fact that technology is not actually the key. And I'm going to break a couple of sacred cows in the smart city space over the next 30 minutes or so. And probably the first one is that I don't think it's that helpful to talk about smart cities as a concept. The term smart city has been around since around 2007, 2008. And everyone has their own perspectives on what smart cities are about. But what we tend to find is that the focus is on IoT-type technologies, the Internet of Things. And it's about sensing and control technologies. But over time, that definition has broadened significantly to pretty much encompass any form of information technology in the context of cities. And therefore, when people are talking about smart city strategies, they're talking about everything from enterprise resource planning systems in the back office all the way through to AI and everything in between. And actually, for me, to be successful, we need to be as inclusive as possible, but not talk about smart cities, but talk about digital cities, how we harness every form of information technology in the context of how the city operates. So that's the first piece. The second is, when we're thinking about the culture of the city, we're moving from a period where we have been managing industrial economics, a physical industrial economy, to a digital economy. And yet the public service, public administration, is still based in a very industrial mode of operation. The agencies and institutions of government are generally built on the legacy of the Industrial Revolution. And to be effective in transitioning to digital, the workforce and the institutions of government have to adopt a completely different mindset, a digital mindset. And over the next 10 years, this city will be successful if it can transform not just the population to start thinking about a digital-first mindset, innovation, entrepreneurship, but thinking about how public administration and public administrators become digital by default. And that's going to take a decade or more, because you don't transform a workforce overnight in terms of the kinds of skills and capabilities. And that's one of the things I'm going to touch on quite a lot today. And the final piece is that citizens absolutely have to be the heart of any strategy and execution that is delivered to be successful. And the reason that we got off to such a slow start in the smart city space as an industry is that we focused on defining the smart city by the technologies that we were implementing, as opposed to the problems that we were solving and the methods we were using to solve those problems. So if you define yourself as smart by having this smart technology or that smart technology, the focus becomes on the implementation, the successful implementation of a technology, as opposed to the service that technology is providing. Now, I've been banging that drum for about the last 7 or 8 years, and I think we're finally at a point now where the default approach to defining a smart city strategy is to start with design. And that's great, because what it means is that we are identifying what the issues are up front, going through a human-centered design approach, and then engineering the technology solutions afterwards. And therefore, we're addressing specific issues, and it's easier to articulate where the value is. But we haven't gone quite far enough. So, in my opinion, there are 4 things that need to be achieved in order to move a smart city from strategy to scale. And it's these 4 things. I've already said a little bit about the design, and I'm going to come back to citizen-centered design in a second. But the first is you have to start by being design-driven. Identify what the issues are that you're trying to solve in society, in communities, and then work with those communities to understand how you can make life easier, faster, cheaper, more fulfilling, and more effective for them. And then think about how you can use technology to achieve those ends. So we start with design, we don't start with technology. Right? So that's the first piece. However, that only gets you as far as probably the pilot stage. You do a design and you pilot how that technology may work. But if you want to move from technology pilot to full-scale rollout, you have to do the other 3 things. And the key is the middle one. How do you get political endorsement? Now, I was talking over lunch to somebody next to me, and we were talking about the fact that the biggest problem we have in achieving scale is getting budget allocated. And there are 3 stakeholders in this process. The first stakeholder is the private sector, who are proposing the types of programs that are being delivered. The second are the city administrators, public servants who are professional public servants who help to administrate the city. And then the third is the politicians. But ultimately, it's the politicians that are the arbiters, that they make the decision about where the money gets invested and at what scale. And the problem is, the city administrators can get your project to the pilot stage. But when you're going and asking for 5, 10, 20 million euros to scale this to rollout, you have to go to the politicians. And the politicians will only ask one question, and that is, where's the value? How is this making my constituents' life better, faster, cheaper? They don't care what the technology is that you're implementing. What they care about is, are you solving the problems of my constituents, and ultimately, are there votes in me supporting this and getting it implemented? And historically, public administrators and the private sector have not been great in articulating the stories of how these technologies make life better in a way that politicians understand and can sell. Because their currency is stories. They tell stories to people, and then people give them their votes in return. And unless we feed the stories to them with some supporting data, we never build the political capital to get political endorsement. So there are 2 elements that I would say are missing in the scaling argument. The first is value. How do we articulate value creation in a way that's meaningful and politicians can sell? And there are 2 sides to that. Firstly, the stories. When I have a new immigrant population coming into a city, a new immigrant family, I want to address the issues of how to integrate those families as quickly as possible. the stories that I can tell around the life and integration of that population is the currency that the politician will sell. But also I then need to back that up with data. And in the private sector, we've got a very good framework for articulating value creation. It's called shareholder value, right? It's economics. But that's only one dimension of what politicians care about and what the public sector care about, because they also care about societal value creation, community value creation, the impact on research and innovation. They care about the environment. And we don't really have good frameworks for measuring value creation on those dimensions. And actually, if you go from one city to another city, the balance between those various different value levers is different. And even if you change administration within a city, the balance of how value is created will differ. And therefore, as public administrators and as a private sector, we have to be able to create metrics that are flexible enough to be able to justify in the terms that the political class understand in order to justify getting the money back. So for me, that's the first piece. The second one is what's at the end, the ecosystem delivery. Now, the days of large technology companies like Accenture or IBM or anyone else being the sole participant in executing these types of programs is long gone. It doesn't happen. The complexity is too broad, the cross-section of technologies is too broad, and therefore the preference for cities is to develop ecosystems for delivery of the strategy. And actually, what we're starting to see, not just here, but all over the world with cities, is that they want to create a thriving ecosystem of young entrepreneurs that can engage in the development of solutions with homegrown solutions. But they want to get the balance right between organizations that can help scale technology, like us, working with innovative, small, nimble, and agile companies like the ones that are outside. But the story from a political perspective is, how do I use this to create a new economic development angle for the city that's going to create economic growth, as well as deliver all the societal outcomes that I want it to deliver? So if you can tell the political story of, I'm delivering a better lifestyle for all of you as your community stakeholders, and I'm delivering economic development and growth, that's the double whammy that is going to drive political endorsement. Because job creation and economic growth combined with value creation for communities is the holy grail. So how do we go about doing that? So the first one, and I won't go into too much depth in this because I actually spoke quite a lot about this in Helsinki last year. I know a few of the audience will probably have been in Helsinki. But the starting point is human-centered design. When we design smart city strategies, we have to start with a view of how we're designing every single element of the program with a citizen at the heart. And that citizen may be an individual, but more likely it will be a citizen in the context of the community that they're operating within. And we tend to create archetypes, so examples of the types of citizens that we want to address. The needs of my grandmother are different to the needs of my 7-year-old son, and yet they're equal stakeholders in the city. And therefore I need to identify the various different needs of those profiles, and I need to design solutions that apply across a broad cross-section of society. So in order to do that, I focus on this. I focus on developing frameworks for thinking about the city that allow them to be responsive, to be engaged, to develop trust in the services that are being delivered. These are the design principles that lay at the heart of every single strategy that we develop. And we would hope that something similar would be at the heart of every other city's development cycle. But actually what we've seen is that there are two types of approach to this. One is you develop the technology, a vendor comes to you and says, I'm willing to put some money in piloting this, You run the pilot, it doesn't cost you very much as a city. They give you a business case and you make a decision whether you want to implement. That path of development, generally it's not very successful. And we end up in this cycle of constant pilots never achieving scale. So what we've tried to do is rethink that process, still starting from design, but with scale as the outcome. And it requires you to go through 6 processes. The first is the observation. I would call this ethnographic research. I send people out into the community to understand the needs of community groups, to define what those archetypes are, and to understand where value can be created. And I work with the political class to understand, what do they care about? Because at the end of the day, they will have specific demographic segments that they are targeting, that they want to affect change in. And in order to do that, you have to understand a day in the life of that community. And the only way to do that is to send ethnographers and anthropologists into the field to observe what's going on. You can't just do secondary research. The second process is human-centered design, citizen-led design. Working with those groups in conjunction with them to co-design the types of solutions that you think will make life better for them. But it's not about us designing a solution for them. It's about us designing solutions with them and getting buy-in from the community. So that's number 2. Then you go into what we call a value architecting phase. How do we tell the stories of what life was like and what life will be like so that we can create political momentum? And then also think about, how do we measure the types of outcomes we want to deliver? Because if I want to tell whether a pilot is going to be successful, I need to create a baseline and then a series of metrics that allow me to articulate the change. And if I get the metrics and the story together, then I've got a fighting chance of getting to scale. Once I've established the baseline and the value proposition, then I go into rapid prototyping phase. And in that phase, it tends to be about developing a capability with the city to rapid prototype in an 8 to 12 week cycle from idea to minimum viable product, what this solution is going to look like. Fail fast, fail cheap, try again. Keep on repeating that cycle until you get to a solution that's going to work and achieves the outcomes that you had set in the value architecting phase. This is a highly iterative process. You don't get it right first time, but you fail fast, you pivot, change, try again. Until such time that you're delivering the outcome, and then you engage with the political stakeholders to get the scale. And then you go back after the event and you demonstrate that you've actually achieved the outcome that you're going to do. Now, there are lots of programs that have gone through the process to piloting. Singapore Smart Nation is probably the biggest and best funded program. But even like 3 weeks ago, there was an article written in the Straits Times, I think, that was talking about the fact that it's a brilliantly engineered and quite well designed program, but it's never captured the imagination of the citizens. Now, I worry about that, because if it's not capturing the imagination of the citizens, it doesn't have any political capital. Now, that may be less of an issue in Singapore, but here, that's deadly, right? If you're not capturing the population's imagination, there will be no support from the political class, because there are other competing priorities. I can spend $10 million on a new bridge, a new piece of infrastructure, new nurses, new teachers, or on technology. And there are competing priorities. So I have to create something more compelling. Now, taking this new style of approach requires a fundamentally different set of capabilities, competencies, and skills in the organization. I touched on it at the beginning. I said, the next decade will be a decade of workforce transformation in the public sector. Now, if you look at each of the 6 stages, there are different skills and capabilities that are required that typically don't exist in the public sector. Like, when we recruit people into public service, we don't tend to think about design thinking, ethnography, user experience design, analytics capabilities. These are not the types of skills that have been developed. The other challenge is the types of technical skills that are required to do rapid prototype development, visualization capabilities, data analytics, IoT development capabilities, cyber capabilities to make sure it's secure. They're some of the hottest and most expensive capabilities to recruit in the market. You are competing against the Accentures and all the startups out there for the same tiny pool of talent that's being created. And that's extremely difficult for the public sector to address because they can't pay the types of salaries that the private sector can pay. Which raises a conundrum. How do we embed these types of capabilities in government? Now, I think there are multiple ways of doing that. And there's a long cycle, organic approach to doing it, which is you work with academic institutions within the city to develop a pipeline of capability, of vocational capability and talent that is going to feed the public sector. And that has to be done, whatever. And I think what I'm starting to see here in Tampere is that there is a focus on that in the university segment, and that there's a very clear drive to building these types of skills and capabilities. My question is that the full spectrum of capabilities, or are we just focused on certain elements of coding and data science? But actually, it's a much broader spectrum of capability that we need to develop. And we need to develop it in the context of how it gets applied in the public sector. So how we think about that, how we build apprenticeships, how we work with the private sector and the public sector to build those capabilities and make sure that there's a good flow of people between the public sector and the private sector is really important. What it really impresses me about Copenhagen as a city is if you look at the city administration, there's a constant flow of people from the public sector into the private sector and back again. And people take a year or 2 years or 3 years, and they go in between the public sector and the private sector, and it's much more porous than I see in other cities. I think that's a really good discipline to have, because it enforces workforce transformation a lot faster. The second thing you need to do is invest. The city needs to invest in the capability development of the public sector workforce to help transform them for the next decade. Robotics, robotic process automation, artificial intelligence is going to fundamentally change the types of jobs that people currently do and the types of jobs that people will need to do in 5 to 10 years' time. In some cases, it's going to take jobs out of the workforce, but in many cases, it's going to create new jobs. But we have to think about how we invest time and resources in the Smart City strategy and developing the types of capabilities that exist in public administration. Now, given the heritage of the administration here in Tampere, I think that's going to be front of mind. But I really can't emphasize enough how important that is. So that's kind of the institutionalization of innovation and building in-house capability. The second is you work with the private sector to co-source these capabilities, or you outsource completely. Now, I don't think that outsourcing what I would consider to be core capabilities is a good idea. Like, I don't think that data science, user-centered design should be things that you fully outsource. However, as you move to smaller administrations and local government, you may not have any choice but to use a shared service. And there are some interesting developments that I'm seeing in Australia and a few other countries where large-ish cities within a metropolitan region are developing centers of excellence that smaller communes around them can tap into those capabilities, and partnering with the private sector to develop these centers of excellence around user-centered design, ethnographic research, analytics, IoT, and cyber, where a small commune may need to develop a web app or need to do some database research, and they can tap into that shared service. And I think that's something that's really worth considering in the context of Tampere, is how does Tampere become a center of excellence and effectively an outsourcing entity for other public administrations? And then what can we do in terms of developing an institutional governance that allows the public and private sector to work together to deliver these skills for both parties? So that's the point about workforce transformation. So there are 2 more slides, and I want to give some time for some questions. I'll try and do this in 5 minutes. I think that the role of the city is changing rapidly. And I think cities are a little bit schizophrenic in terms of the way that they think about what their role is in managing the digital economy. When you go back to the agricultural economy and the industrial economy, the role of the city in making the market for the industrial economy and the agricultural economy was very clear. In the agricultural economy, cities and towns set marketplaces where people could come and sell their goods and services. In the industrial economy, cities invested in building production facilities, marketplaces, retail spaces, utilities and infrastructure, especially here, first city in Finland, right, to develop electricity. That role for the city was really clear. When it comes to the digital economy, I think honestly cities feel that they don't have a right to play, or they don't understand exactly what role they have to play. They feel that the private sector has all the skills and capabilities and the public sector has a deficit. But actually, I think there are these 6 roles that a city needs to play. I do think that the private sector and other institutions can end up delivering a lot of what needs to be delivered, but the city still has these 6 key roles. They have to set the vision for what they want the city to look like and the types of services they want delivered. But then step back and allow the private sector to execute. The second is they need to set the guidelines, the barriers, the regulation, and the legislation that shows the private sector where the guardrails are in terms of security, for example, data privacy. They have to get the governance and institutional framework right, from national to regional to local. Who does what, and what are the types of institutions that we need? Do we need a CIO? Do we need a data repository with a special governance structure? And what are the types of institutions that we need to develop going forwards? Do we need to develop shared service type capabilities for other administrations or across the administration? Then there's this, what I've already talked about, the digital skills and capabilities development. They've got to develop the programs to build those skills in the community to service the economy and also to transform the workforce within the public administration. There's an open innovation platform role. Now, at the most basic level, that's about open data and creating open data portals. But actually, I think that there's more of a role in enabling the ecosystem of entrepreneurs to be able to engage, to understand what services the city wants to buy, and then to actually buy those services and to procure those services from the ecosystem, to get the right balance of large companies and entrepreneurs. And then finally, they need to step in where there's a market failure, where the private sector isn't stepping in to provide that service, broadband connectivity for small communities. The private sector may never step in. There's a role for government in becoming the provider of last resort for that infrastructure. But it's only in that provision. So, I'll close out on these 3 things. So, what do I think Finnish cities need to do, and especially here in Tampere? The first is, We need to set the vision and we need to demonstrate the use cases, but critically we need to tell the stories of how those use cases are delivering value. We need to tell the political stories and we need to create a framework for developing and articulating quantitatively how we're creating value. The storytelling is the key though. We have to become better storytellers. Secondly, we need to build the capabilities for digital disruption, not just in the ecosystem and within the community, but within the administration. We have to invest in long-term workforce transformation. It needs to start now, and it needs to be a commitment for the next decade. And if we don't, then the city will never have the capabilities internally to be good buyers of those services. And then we need to focus our innovation inside. The city needs to look at the core processes and services that it delivers and be the first patient that they deal with. Use the technology to make the core services, issuing licenses, issuing permits, as seamless, as cheap, and as effective as possible, freeing up budget to invest in workforce transformation and new service delivery. So for me, the smart city needs to become about digital, and the first place you have to focus is on what you do as an administration and make that more effective, productive, and efficient. That frees up budget to reinvest. And then finally, we have to apply that into the core processes, and we need to deliver change at the front line. The people that are delivering services face-to-face, the social workers, the teachers, the people that are on front line of service delivery in the city need to be the first people that are enabled with these tech tools and technologies. Because that builds confidence. That builds confidence in our ability to be able to provide new services and better services. So that's my manifesto. I may have slayed a few sacred cows. I hope I have. Because at the moment, what we're doing isn't getting the results that we need. I think cities like this have a huge benefit because you don't have the barriers of governance that large cities have, and you're on the right cycle, the optimistic cycle of growth. And that's the right time to implement, to be innovative, to be nimble, to be agile. And I think the administration understands that. I hope that over the next few years we're going to see that develop. And I would love to be coming back here every year to see how that journey delivers and to see this city flourish. So thank you very much for having me. I'd love to have some questions. I've actually got to run at 3:45 to catch a flight. But thank you so much for having me here today.
Let's give a quick round of applause for Simon. And do we have the catch box? And, oh good, right here we have a catch box. So if you have a question for Simon, please raise your hand. Don't be shy. Now is the only time. You won't be able to talk to him after he's done. He has a flight out right over here. Run the catch box down there. Just shout into the black part like it's a microphone, because it is. Very nice.
Hi, thank you very much. Very inspiring talk. You mentioned how it may be difficult for cities to compete for skilled workforce. That may be true now, but I don't think it's impossible, and cities may have some things to offer that Accenture or smaller companies might not even have. So would you like to comment on that? What do you think their strategy could be?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. And if you look at the millennial population, it's a very different workforce to the Generation Y and Generation X workforce, in that there's more of a sense of purpose. And what we see is people having a much more rapid transition in their careers, where they do move in and out of jobs much more rapidly, and are willing to go into the public sector to perform a job that has a sense of purpose and direction and value. And then will be quite happy to move back into the private sector. So I think what I talked about in Copenhagen is probably at the vanguard. I think what we'll see is many more cities doing that. And what I would hope actually is that all tech organizations take an active role in encouraging their employees to go and take time in public service and then to come back. And I think it's beneficial for both parties. So I certainly encourage that in my organization. when people are coming to a natural career point transition, then it may be a discussion that I have with one of the client cities that I have to say, this person is interested in doing a couple of years in public service to get real-world experience. They normally jump at that chance because they're getting a highly trained person for a couple of years. And I jump at it because I know in a couple of years back time, they're more likely to want to come back to my organization. I would hope that that's going to be the case for many organizations.
It's a great question. We have another question in the audience. We've got 6 minutes before Simon's out the door. Yeah, exactly. Right behind you. There you go. Nice.
Hi. Well, you discussed a lot the roles that cities need when they are driving innovation, but if we look at cities more like a platform, like you mentioned this one example of the roles that cities can take, where cities are enabling third parties to develop services. You mentioned open data, you mentioned the importance of using procurement in a smart way. What kind of skill set do you think this requires from the city, this kind of approach, and do you see some cities doing it right at the moment, and what kind of roles they are using, or have they created some new roles in the city side to do this?
Yeah, I think you touched on two of the key ones. So the first one is creating an open innovation portal and or ecosystem. So actually engaging with the community and playing an active role in market making that community and providing the infrastructure to give accessibility to core data or even core tools. And I think as cities transition their core systems from client server to the cloud, it's going to be a lot easier to develop the types of APIs that make that available. The cost and complexity of providing data and tools will become a lot lower. And therefore, I think we'll see that. I think the second is training people to understand the technology within the city administration, not be scared of the technology, but to have a working knowledge and competency of the type of technologies we're talking about, knowing what an API is, knowing what analytics is, knowing what IoT is, knowing what security is. Even at the most basic level, right? But having a working capability in that. But also, in the procurement department specifically, trying to understand how you get the balance right between encouraging the participation of small businesses and dealing with the concerns that they have about contracting with large state entities and the complexity and the cost of managing that type of procurement, as well as the concerns of being a private sector organization subcontracting to a large tech organization like Accenture, where they're worried that their IP is going to get stolen or that they're somehow going to get disintermediated by the larger organization. So I think those are probably the two key ones. In terms of who's doing it well, I think certainly Amsterdam has done it well. Interestingly, probably the most advanced procurement that I had seen was the procurement mechanism that was put in place by London around the Olympics. So they created the Olympic framework for procurement was really quite innovative. The European Union overall is trying to address some of these procurement issues. Interestingly, I was speaking to the administration here in Tampere, and I think Teppo and the team that are working, Tero and the others, understand this issue intimately and will really drive at this because they know that it is a barrier. Are there challenges? Yes, absolutely. Do I think they're committed to solving it? Yeah, I think they are. Well, certainly they seem to be.
Well, I think we have time for one more short question. Back there in the, maybe stand up so that our catch box can find it.
We have one question, and then there's also a very interesting question on the wall. I could read it out.
Yeah, fine.
Okay,
I'll try and be short and do two.
It's not a huge airport, Tampere Airport, but still, we got to get you home.
Hi. What could be the role of the local university in developing a smart city environment and smarter services?
Sorry, just to be clear, was that a university or an open university?
University.
University. So I think there are multiple roles for universities in this process. I think at one level, there's something about talent development, workforce optimization, and vocational training, right? So not just doing purely academic research, but actually taking the role of vocational training and basic competence and capability development within the administration. Now, what I think is very important here is how do you retain that talent in Tampere after they've been through university and stopped them exiting either to other countries or to Helsinki or elsewhere. And the way to do that is to engage those people in the ecosystem and to develop a lifestyle that makes them want to stay. And I think that's absolutely doable. So that's number one. Number two, applied research, making sure that the university is taking its primary research and thinking about applied research and how that actually gets taken into the marketplace. And working directly with the administration to understand where the types of applied research that are occurring can have direct applicability. So I was looking at some of the VTT autonomous research. I think that's a great example of where that's going. But I could think of everything from public health and dealing with type 2 diabetes and public health issues, addressing those types of capabilities with applied research and innovation would be key. And the third area would be around how do you actually get applied research into accelerators and incubators to develop the types of businesses that are going to become the core part of the ecosystem going forward. So those would be my three.
I can read the question off the wall if you'd like to hear it real quick.
Perfect.
And this will be the last one. Says from Jonas, how are we transforming traditional politicians to the digital age? Or are they simply going to be value-oriented instruments in the administration who don't understand the projects?
I mean, at the end of the day, this comes back to us. I don't think the problem is with them. I think the problem is with us. If a politician doesn't understand the technology, we're not going to fundamentally upskill those people in the type of time frame that we need. Yes, there's some coaxing and some development and some articulation of the basics that need to happen. But at the end of the day, we need to find better mechanisms for communicating what we're doing. And if we're trying to communicate in technological terms, telling them about the technologies we're using, we have completely missed the point. We have to communicate in terms that they understand. It's like any form of communication, whether that's improvisation or whether it's public speaking. You need to use a vocabulary that your audience understands. I generally fail at that. But, that's the secret. Know your audience and adapt your message and your medium of communication to be compelling. Don't blame the audience if they don't understand, blame yourself. So hopefully I've left everyone at least partially understanding what I've had to say. But if you have any more questions, tweet me, contact me on LinkedIn. I publish tons of stuff on LinkedIn, so if you're interested in this space, give me a follow and you'll see all the content I'm developing. And as I say, hopefully I'm going to be back over the next few years and I'll be able to track the journey. But thank you so much for having me.
Let's give a round of applause for Simon Giles from Accenture. Go catch your flight. All right.